Kia ora and welcome to the Happy Revolution podcast. My name is Mika, and I'm joined by my co-host and flatmate, Rayne. Today, we're chatting with Reverend Dr. Karen Kemp. Karen is a mother, academic, and teacher, and presently works as a lecturer and coach at Laidlaw Theological College. This conversation with Karen was so interesting that we chatted for nearly 3 hours, so we have split the conversation into 2 episodes. In part 1, we chat about peace and reconciliation, and next week, in the second part, we chat about Christian leadership and hope.
If you're listening to this podcast with headphones on, you might notice the sound of jangling throughout the conversation. That sound is Karen's bracelets and bangles. So when you hear that sound, you can just imagine Karen gesturing emphatically to illustrate her point as she talks. We really love this conversation, and we hope you do too.
Can you tell us a bit about where and how you grew up?
So I grew up in Chile, in South America, and my parents were missionaries. So they were missionaries with the Salvation Army initially, and so we left New Zealand when I was 2, and we came back for furlough halfway through. So 5 years later, we came back to New Zealand for 6 months. That was when I was 8, and then we went back for another 5 years. So we had 10 years altogether between my ages 2 and 12. And then from 12 to 20, we lived in Australia, in Sydney. I did my high schooling in Australia and my nursing training in Sydney. Then I went back to Chile to work. So I went back and worked in the deep south. I'd grown up in the sort of halfway up the country, in the middle part of the country near the capital, Santiago. But when I went back as an adult, I went to the deep south and worked in a mission hospital with the Indigenous people on an Indigenous reservation, basically, for the Mapuche Indigenous people. I was there for nearly 3 years. Then I took some time out and spent 6 months in England, where I did some hospice nursing. And then off the back of that, I came to New Zealand really for the first time in my mid-20s, actually. Came back to go to do some theological studies. So I came back, lived in Ashburton for a year, saved some money, worked in the Ashburton Hospital, and then moved up to Auckland to do my undergrad, my BPhil at Laidlaw. It was then the Bible College of New Zealand. I had 3 years there, really good years. Got married at the end of my second year to Hugh, who I met there. Hugh grew up in India in a missions family, and he had done pretty much the same trajectory, sort of between India, New Zealand, back to India, back to New Zealand to do some theological study. And we were both sort of heading toward missions at that point. So we finished our degree. Then we had 2 years in pastoral ministry down in Mossburn in the deep south of New Zealand. Tiny little village, great place though, farming community. So we were joint pastors in a Presbyterian church in Mossburn. And then at the end of that time, we went overseas, moved to Ulaanbaatar in Outer Mongolia, and had 3 years there altogether. Came back from there and settled back in Christchurch for a couple of years. Moved up to Palmerston North. Hugh was the Dean of the Bible College branch there. And had nearly 11 years there actually in the end. Lived on a lifestyle block. The 2 eldest, Anjali and Mickey, they did all their primary and high schooling in Palmerston North, and Anya was born in Palmerston North. Toward the end of that time, Hugh was finishing his PhD, which he finished. He then worked at Massey for a couple of years at the university. And during that time I did a master's with Chris Marshall here at Victoria, and that was my master's study in conflict transformation in faith communities. I was also in ministry on and off during that time in Palmerston North. I taught at the local branch of the Bible College, taught in the counselling program and in the certificate program there. And I did quite a bit of youth work through the church. I was a university chaplain on the Massey University team, but working at UCOL in Palmerston North. Loved it, loved all of it. Really enjoyed working with that young adult age group through those years. The year I finished my master's, Hugh got a job back over in England, actually. So we moved to England. We sold everything up in New Zealand, and with the girls moved to England. That was back in 2011, early 2011. And we had 3 really good years in England. Hugh was head of missions at a college there, and I basically just found my feet when we got there. Ended up lecturing in 3 different colleges. I lectured in the New Testament studies, in ethics, and looking after people training for ministry, so supervising interns basically. I was ordained during that time in the Church of England, and worked at Gloucester Cathedral, which is one of the great cathedrals in England. Really good experience there. And then at the end of those 3 years, the visa authorities in England changed the rules, and they've continued to change actually. So we realised we'd probably need to come home at some point, and around about that time the role came up at St John's College in Auckland, and we moved back here in end of 2013. So I started at St John's in 2014, and I've been the dean there since then. I've just finished in May this year. There were 8 really rich years, very different from anything I'd done before because of the 3 tikanga dynamics at the college. Hadn't really had much experience working with Pacifica before, and just loved actually leaning into that bicultural space really intentionally, and also just being part of the rich cultural dynamics around the 3 tikanga church. My role as a dean was to oversee the formation in the ministry training of all tikanga Pākehā students on track for ordination. So in that role I did quite a bit of teaching, again taught New Testament again, and oversaw the ministry formation program, wrote the curriculum for that off the back of my doctoral work, and worked with a great team of people supervising students in their placements, and also on the leadership team of the college. So there was quite a mix of teaching, mentoring, coaching with students, spiritual formation stuff, and then the leadership dimensions of college in meeting the strategic plan set by the board. Yeah,
that's crazy. You've been all over the place.
How many countries have you lived in?
Yeah. Well, New Zealand's a culture, it's a very particular cultural space. England is a much more particular cultural space than we give it credit for in relation to New Zealand, as is Australia, actually, as you know. Mongolia was out of the box entirely. We had to learn a new language. We had to learn to live. The temperatures in Mongolia dropped down to about -40 centigrade, and you live well below zero for about 8 months of the year. So really different climate from what we were used to. Amazing people, very hospitable people. And we love being part of the church right from the ground up. There was almost nothing there in 1990, and the Mongols pulled out of the Soviet Union, basically with a sit-in in the square of the main city. They sat there and said, "We're not moving until we're given our freedom." And it was an interesting time because it was only a couple of years after Tiananmen Square and all the stuff that played out there in China, in Beijing, and this was a really different beast. So the Mongols got their independence or their freedom from the management of Russia, of the Soviet Union, and we went in. At that point, we came in with a whole bunch of other Westerners who came in, and it was just a really interesting time actually for them as a nation, as they found their own feet literally, because the Russians left pretty promptly en masse. There were a lot of people left, and many of the senior roles in science and education, in agriculture, in medicine particularly, all those senior roles tended to be Russians. And so when they all left, all of a sudden there were people having to step up into roles that they'd never been in. So the place was a very challenging space. And of course we took a toddler in there with us. She was 18 months when we went there. But again, just seeing the growth in the church, really from nothing. I think, there were 2 or 3 believers pre-1990, and in the short space of time that we were there, the church just grew like a mushroom. It spread all through the whole country and developed beyond belief, really, in the short space of time. It was such an exciting time to be there, actually. You'd literally, as a foreigner, they hadn't had foreigners there before. I think pre-1990, they used to issue 1 or 2 tourist visas per annum to non-Mongolians to come in. So all of a sudden, there's all these foreigners walking around, being part of the place. So it wasn't uncommon for people to stop you on the street and ask you where you were from. The Jesus movie came in, and there were billboards in the city cinemas with the Jesus movie on one, Arnold Schwarzenegger on another, Sylvester Stallone with Rambo movies on another, and there was no sort of differentiating between them. So people would stop you and say, do you know about Jesus? Can you tell me about Jesus? Or the New Testament had shown up on all the on the street walk stalls where they sold books, and a lot of people bought it but didn't know what it was. So there were people reading the New Testament for the first time all over the country, not knowing what they were reading, and stopping foreigners in the street and saying, "Do you know about this book? Can you tell me about it?" So there's some amazing stories, actually. It's really easy to think when that kind of thing happens, when you get a bunch of people go into a place and everything mushrooms out and grows. It's really easy to think there was something in the water at that time and it just all happened. But actually, when Hugh did his master's looking at the history of Christianity in Mongolia, and, there were people came across from Europe, Roman Catholic and Nestorian missionaries as well, centuries and centuries before, during the days of Genghis Khan, actually. In fact, one of Kublai Khan's wives was actually a Christian. And so way, way back in their history, there were Christians amongst the Mongols and amongst the elite in the Mongolian court. But of course, it had all been wiped out over time. there's a really cool story. I don't know how much time we've got, but we could talk about Mongolia the whole time actually. But there was a really cool, sad story actually of back in the day. I think it was under either Genghis Khan or Kublai Khan. They decided that they wanted a religion to help unify the tribes, because the Mongol tribes are all separate, marauding, sort of fighting tribes, and they were unified under Genghis Khan into one big group. And so he decided they should have a common religion. So he sent a message all the way to Rome to ask the Pope if they would send missionaries or some priests out to Mongolia to basically to tell them how to be Christians, because they wanted the whole country to be Christian. So the message, you can imagine, it took a long time along the Silk Road route back to Rome, and the message got through, and in Rome they managed to find, I think, 3 volunteers, priests, monks, who decided that they would go. And they set out. I think one either died or dropped away on the way. I think 2 of them maybe finally got there, but it was 2 or 3 years of lapse. And in the meantime, I can't remember if it was Kublai Khan or Genghis Khan, whichever one it was, had got tired of waiting and recruited the yellow hat sect of Tibetan Buddhism from Tibet, and said, okay, we'll be Buddhist. And so the country's been known as a Buddhist nation all these centuries, but it was through an absolute quirk of history, actually. And so to see it really blossoming in all these years later is quite amazing. Incredible.
What did Hugh do his PhD? What was his thesis about?
So he did his master's in the history of Christianity amongst the Mongols, but he's always had a real interest in Tibetan Buddhism. And so when he came to do his PhD, he looked at the question of why is it that New Zealanders, and by that he meant not sort of people who've moved here from South Asian countries that are already Buddhist, but actual Western Europeans, largely, or Māori people in New Zealand, why do they become Buddhists? So it was a question around why do they convert to Buddhism. So he took a few years to do that, visited all the Buddhist, pretty much all the Buddhist sort of centres around New Zealand, and interviewed lots of people.
Did you say your master's was in conflict?
Conflict transformation. But so I looked at it through the lens of peace studies, and specifically looking at it from the point of view of how do Christian communities deal with conflict.
That would be really interesting to talk about. How do Christian communities deal with it?
Not well, unfortunately. Yeah, it's fair to say all the study I've done, all the theological study I've done, I've been tipped into by something that happened that drove me to go and learn some more, to make sense of something using a theological lens. So that includes my BThol, my undergraduate degree in theology. There'd been a whole lot of questions that bubbled up when I was working in the south of Chile, where I realised I'd been trained really well as a nurse to look after people physically and sociologically, but nothing prepared me to actually care for people spiritually and make sense of some of the stuff they were facing. So that tipped me into doing my undergraduate theology degree. I was hungry for answers, I'd sit in class just wanting to understand just how things fitted. And similarly, my master's degree fell out of really a situation of really severe conflict in the church that I was in at the time. There was a serious church conflict amongst the leadership, and it was a really painful time for people, it really split the church. Lawyers were involved, counsellors were involved, mediators were involved, and the whole thing was resolved in that after a year of some pretty heavy duty meetings and conversations, the issue was resolved by people moving on, but actually the relational damage that had happened because of the conflict went largely unaddressed. So I remember coming out of that conflict thinking, there's got to be a better way to do this. On the surface, I couldn't see that we'd handled that situation any differently than if we hadn't been Christian. There didn't seem to be much difference there. So I had done my undergrad New Testament and Ethics studies with Chris Marshall at Laidlaw Collage up in Auckland, and so I had talked with Chris over the years about doing a master's with him in that sort of general field of ethics, the whole question of, as Christians then, how then do we live in the light of biblical studies, theology. So I went back to Chris. I knew I wanted to study under his supervision. So my master's was a research master's. There was no taught component. And I wanted to ask the question, so how do we do conflict better in Christian communities? I basically looked at a range of approaches to dealing with conflict in the secular world. So I looked at different conflict resolution theories and processes that people have used. And in the mix of that, I looked at conflict transformation, which is a way of approaching conflict developed. The person who's written the most about it and who really put it on the map is a guy called John Paul Lederach, who was a Mennonite peace builder 30 years ago now. He was a peace builder in Central America in some of the most intractable conflict settings, and he just learned a lot about conflict, particularly around conflicts in places where there was historical wounds and where there was the whole post-colonial thing playing out. But also, obviously, in the midst of genuine wartime conflicts, so civil war scenarios. But he learned a whole different way of viewing conflict. So conflict resolution processes largely focus on dealing with the issue. So, you think about, so what's the problem, where did the problem come from, and how do we fix this? Conflict transformation, it does focus on the issue, but it focuses mostly around the structural dynamics and the relationships that led to the issue happening in the first place. And so the way of dealing with the conflict attends to the relationships as much as the issue itself and to the structures. So it's a much more holistic approach to dealing with conflict. John Paul Lederach is a Mennonite peace builder, so it was a faith-based understanding of conflict. And so in my master's, I looked at conflict transformation theory and brought it into conversation with mostly Matthew 18, actually, in the Gospel of Matthew. There's a whole chapter in there that I think the whole chapter's about conflict, actually. But in the middle of the chapter, there's some really well-known verses which typically get preached on when the church is going through conflict. And they're the verses, if your brother sins against you, go one-on-one. And if they don't listen, then take someone with you. And if they still don't listen, then take it to the church. And then it goes from there into the parable of the unforgiving servant. So typically we preach on those three things to do in the middle of a conflict, And traditionally, many churches, by the time it got to, if they still don't listen, take it to the church, that was the point where somebody got up on Sunday morning, publicly denounced the person, and they got excommunicated. So traditionally, those verses have been interpreted in quite a harsh, sort of 3 counts and you're out kind of approach. As a whole, the chapter begins with the disciples squabbling over who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom, and Jesus saying, actually, if you don't become humble like a child, you're not even going to get your foot in the door, let alone get to be head dog, head honcho. So Jesus rebukes them, and then there's a piece in there about causing other people to stumble. If you cause your brother or your sister to stumble, then it, you'll be judged for that. And then it goes from there into looking at the stray, at somebody who strays away, and Jesus reminding them that the stray is precious and that there's angels that stand before the Father in heaven reporting on how those strays are doing, almost. And then there's those verses about, if your brother sins against you. So if you take the whole chapter together, it's actually a really powerful and highly nuanced approach to dealing with conflict in the church. And so I took the theology from Matthew's Gospel and I brought it into conversation with the practice of Mennonite conflict transformation, peace-building processes. The peace-building processes Mennonites use are largely used in war zones still. So I had to take the principles of that and apply them at a more congregational level. As part of that, I travelled to the States in 2010 and did the Summer Institute of International Peacebuilding at the International Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Harrisonburg in Virginia. And a lot of the processes that I've used in conflict transformation since came out of that time. So again, I was in a class of 26 people in my cohort doing these master's papers, and there would have been 22 nationalities maybe, and there was in the mix were heads of government from different places. There was people who worked in the Pentagon. There were community activists that were anti what the government was doing. There were people from Israel and Palestine. There were people from a range of countries in the Arab world. There were people from Latin America. There were United Nations workers. There were peace activists. There were Muslims. There were Jews. And there were Christians, and there were completely secular people from the communist countries. So it was a really, if there was going to be conflict in our class, we were really well set up for it, actually, in terms of really polarising views. We spent a month together doing these courses and just learning some really cool tools, actually, just for engaging dialogue across difference to begin with, for analysing conflict when it happens, trying to understand what's actually going on so that when a conflict happens we don't end up focusing on the symptoms of the conflict, but we actually go to the root causes and deal with those.
I'm curious with enacting some of those processes. When a community comes into conflict, how can you enact some of those things and sort of address the holistically structural issues as well as relationships, and how can you see all of that? Because it seems like often there often are these huge structural issues that often just don't get seen or just get overlooked.
That's a really good question, and right now I actually need a whiteboard because you're absolutely right. There's layers and layers in there. John Paul Lederach has a nested, if you can imagine, a set of concentric circles that are nested inside each other. So you might have the issue in the middle, then you've got the relationships around that issue, all the different people that are impacted by the issue or that have a vested interest in the issue. And then outside of that again, you've got the structures, the institutional structures maybe that hold the issue, that hold the space. And that structure in itself is nested in a culture and a nation, and it moves out. So in attending well to the conflict, you've actually got to find processes that will attend to all of those layers. The simplest way I can put it is that you need to bring all those different lenses to the problem, to whatever the problem is on the table. So you need to be asking, what's the issue? What are the symptoms that there's a conflict happening here? Who's involved? Like, who are the people impacted by this? And even that will be there'll be the people directly involved, but then there's their family or their friends or their community. So it could be an ethnic community that's impacted, or a denominational grouping, or a group within a church, or whatever it is. So there'll be the relationships, and then the structures themselves will relate to where people fit in the structure. Like, do they have a voice? Is the place structured in such a way that their voices are heard? Are the structures conducive to flourishing, or are they structures that constrain and confine people? So they're the different lenses we bring to the conflict. And the most critical thing, I think, in my experience of, where I have used these processes and working with communities that are in conflict, and the key idea, I think, there is to make sure that the way we go about dealing with the conflict is actually building relationship, not increasing the division or deepening the divide. So, if you come in and you say, okay, what's the problem? Let's sort the problem. Here's the problem. Okay, let's mediate or negotiate. If you approach it that way, oftentimes both sides compromise more than they're happy with to come up with a solution that looks really tidy on paper, but the reality is they've hurt each other deeply in the process, and they haven't attended to that. For the real sort of deep forgiveness and reconciliation piece is left. The relationships aren't mended. So we might be able to sort the issue by using a particular process, but if the process hasn't allowed the relationships to be open to dialoguing, to hearing both sides, and to empathizing with each other in ways that lead to genuine forgiveness, then actually 2 or 3 years down the track, it'll be another issue. But if those relationships haven't been sorted, it'll polarize down the same lines. It's like a fault line in an earthquake. The split will go down the same lines, and the relationships will sit in the same spaces in relation to each other, regardless of the issue. So to go back to the church conflict, one of the things that I discovered halfway through that period of time was that the division in that congregation actually represented the same division. It was the same families on either side of this issue as had fallen out with each other 30 years prior over a conflict, and then 30 years later I'm a newcomer to that congregation, and all of a sudden I become aware that the division that I'm seeing on this issue actually is the same one from back then. And the Old Testament prophets talk about this. If you read, I think Jeremiah particularly has some passages about the the prophets that go about the land saying peace, peace, where there is no peace. And the prophet uses this really sharp image of conflicts that happen where the leaders come along and they lay planks over the top of this pit of murk and distrust and anger and all the stuff you don't want in a community. And we just lay a plank over and we paint it over with whitewash. And what conflict transformation says is we've got to deal with that stuff. It's not good enough to make it neat and tidy on the surface, because if we do, a few years down the tracks, that stuff underneath will just bubble up and out it'll come all over again like a dormant volcano. So, yes, and there's processes to do that well. They're not complicated, but they take time. So that's the other big difference, actually. If you go for a conflict resolution approach, you can have, a few meetings and negotiations, and you pop out the other side and you've sorted it, and you think, okay, we can crack on with life. If you're going to attend to the root causes of an issue and the relationships that have been impacted by the issue, it's going to take a lot longer, which is why we're not so good at doing that.
Are those processes, are they like quite a case-by-case thing, or is there sort of like a few general processes that you'd apply to different situations that is sort of similar? Yeah, so probably the really key processes are, firstly, that one of the first things we do in conflict, and if you stop and really think about this, I think you'll find it's true for even simple conflicts, is when something goes wrong, we react and then we make assumptions. And I'm talking about something that happens in a split second. You have a spat with someone, and in those few seconds, you're bringing a whole lot of assumptions about what the problem is and what caused it, and also assumptions about what that person is like and why they did that. So one of the biggest lessons I took from taking a transformative approach is the lesson to stop, to actually pause, take a step back, and take the time, to remind myself that God's plan for the whole world and us in our relationships is a plan about being reconciled with each other, with God and with creation. So that's the big picture that we live life in as Christians. So when something goes wrong, we need to step back long enough to reconnect with that picture and remind ourselves of what God is looking for when we fall out with each other. And then step 2 of that is to take the time to do an analysis, like to figure out what's going on. And again, this is a whiteboard moment again for me, but you can visualize. If you can visualize a tree on a page, visualize a tree with a nice big trunk and deep roots going out underneath everywhere. And then you've got the foliage of the tree and, lots of leaves and branches. The foliage of the tree are all the things that you can see, hear, and tangibly find. So in a conflict, well, you can probably tell me you've had a number of conflicts. What would you expect to see, in your flat or with friends that you've fallen out with? What does that look like? I don't mean what you think's going on or why it's happening, but what would we expect to see in a conflict?
I think a change in the voice is always really tricky, and physical body language changes, either really quickly retreating or looking like you're up for a fight.
Probably more pointed language as well.
Yeah, and so pointed language, but also generalizations. You always do this. What about things like slamming doors or stomping feet? I mean, I know that never happens in translate, but not in your house.
Yeah, I suppose I would think that would be more serious.
Yeah, if that happened, that would be really problematic.
Another real classic, I mean, one of my favourite quotes of all time around conflict is by a guy called Alan Kreider, who's another Mennonite. But he says, enemies are people we talk about, not with. So again, I think that's another one of those foliage things. The things we see tangibly around a conflict is when people triangulate each other. When I'm talking to Mika about Rayne, and there's a whole other podcast around how we deal with triangulation. That's a whole thing in its own. But, you know, all of life is made up of triangulated relationships. So we've got to figure out how to deal with them in healthy ways. So the foliage of the tree, if we're looking at a conflict tree to analyse the conflict, the foliage is the stuff you can see, observe, hear, and it's the visible. So it's the symptoms, but they're the symptoms. They're not the conflict isn't a slamming door. The conflict isn't people talking about people. There's something else going on. So, and I do this exercise with groups. You know, we actually get post-it notes. We have a big tree drawn up on a flip chart or a board, and people write up all the things they can actually see that are happening around them, and we put them all up as leaves on the tree. And then we look at all of that and we ask ourselves, so why is that stuff happening? Where's that coming from? What are the relationships, the structures, the theology even, that have led to this stuff up here happening? And they're your roots. So you label all your roots. And at the root level, you're talking about things like decision-making processes, communication, level of transparency. Theology plays a really big part, especially around leadership. You know, the leader who thinks they've got to have all the answers and be the heroic leader is actually going to lead quite differently than somebody who sees themselves as being a servant and taking people with them. So it's not necessarily that there's a wrong and a right theology, but that the people who are in disagreement with each other that are exhibiting all these symptoms are actually exhibiting those symptoms because their theologies are not in agreement with each other. So if you believe in a top-down, hierarchical, autocratic way of leading, and you're trying to work alongside somebody whose leadership style is really differently, they're coming from a servant leadership end of things, then you're going to be clashing with each other. I'm trying to think what else would sit in there. Role ambiguity is a really big one in conflict. And actually, leaders coming into church communities is a classic here. You know, a church community calls a new minister or vicar to come, and the person comes and they preach an amazing sermon, and they're a wonderful person, they've got a lovely family, and the community's really excited, and the person arrives. But the leader's expectations of what they're supposed to do and not do, and the community's expectations may be really different. And unless they dialogue and talk about that and bring those things into the open, pretty soon there's going to be a conflict come up there. A lot of conflicts happen because of unmet expectations. But if we don't know what the expectations are, how can we meet them? Or how can we even agree that they're realistic or reasonable expectations? So they're your roots. And when you're doing the exercise in a community, you get all your roots out there, and no answer's too stupid. Everybody gets involved. Everybody's got post-it notes, and you end up with lots of stuff. The symptoms and the roots. And then what I usually get people to do is to try and group those root causes into categories, or to try and bring them down to just one or two key issues that have led to this particular problem. So it could be that when you look at what's happened, you decide actually the really key root cause here was lack of communication. Honestly, so many conflicts come back to that, lack of communication. That if the parties had actually communicated more clearly with each other in both directions, then they would never have ended up at odds with each other. You know, it's the classic, oh, you meant that, or you didn't tell me that. I didn't know that that was what was expected or what you hoped for. So once you can narrow it down to communication, for example, then you can put that out in front of you. You've got your two disagreeing parties, you've got communication on the table. Okay, now let's talk. How do you need me to communicate? How would you like to communicate? What would you like to know? What levels of disclosure are we talking about? You know, if we're planning forward, then how shall we communicate that so that everybody in the flat knows what's going on and not just one or two people? So, I mean, that's a really simple tool which gets you well on the road. If you don't take the time for that analysis, you can imagine, right? Oh, Rayne, she's been slamming doors all week. She's obviously having a rough time. She didn't do so well in her paper the other day. It's bound to be that. Well, you know what, Rayne, she's just fragile. You've just got to, we've just got to learn to just tiptoe around Rayne because she's fragile. Look at her, she's slamming doors. It's very, very unlikely that we've got it right. So we have to take time to step back and ask ourselves what's really going on here and find ways to do that well. Once we've pinned it down a little bit, then the next lot of processes we use are the processes of dialogue. So a discussion and a dialogue are two really different things. And I think as Westerners, particularly as university-trained Westerners, we're really good at discussion, at getting our argument together to prove our point. And we do that intuitively, automatically. So dialogue is about open listening, about listening and speaking without jumping to conclusions or being invested in the outcome of that conversation. And that's a learned skill as well, actually. So one of the processes that the Mennonites use a lot is the Indigenous circle process, where you have a talking stick and you have a question. You warm the circle up by asking a question about maybe, what's on top for you today, whatever it is. And you literally speak when you have the talking piece, you pass it on to the next person and you go around the circle. What that does is it slows the conversation right down. It lets people think a little bit more about what they're saying. It lets people really listen because you're not allowed to speak if you're not holding the talking piece. It also allows for... So one of the lovely things about a circle process is that if somebody next to you says something that you think actually is something we all need to really take on board, then you can take the talking piece and gift your time for silence, for that person to be really heard at a deeper level, and then you can pass it on. The circle process is really good because you'll hear introverts say things that you'd never have heard otherwise. And those of us who are more extroverted, we actually have to learn the discipline of just being quiet and listening, which we're not so good at. I mean, one of the things I love about the circle process is that you can build it in as it's not something you pull out when you've had a conflict. And it's the same with dialogue, actually. Dialogue and circles are the two things that I think we should all be practicing all of the time, so that when a conflict does happen, we're not having to learn a process as well as deal with the conflict. So, I can imagine in a flat setting, what would it look like once a week with your flat meeting to do a circle process and just have, 2 or 3 simple questions that you do every time. Some weeks it'll take 10 minutes and other weeks it might take 3 hours, depending on what's going on. I heard a great quote recently about introverts and extroverts, going back to that. Someone once said that if you don't know what an extrovert thinks, you're not listening. And if you don't know what an introvert thinks, you haven't asked. So I think that is a really big dynamic, actually. One of the things that John Paul Laidlaw will often talk about when he's talking about dealing with conflict is asking the question of whose voices are not being heard here. Or are you in a situation where big decisions are being made about people who are not actually sitting there to represent themselves? That is one of the key things that leads to conflict in a community down the track. Because what you have to do in that situation is you have to make assumptions about what someone else thinks, and you haven't always asked. So, if you get to the point in a discussion, there are leadership meetings and there are times when you do have to make decisions and not everybody can be in the room. But I think if you get to the point in a decision-making meeting where someone says, well, I wonder how this will impact this group of people. Well, I wonder how they would feel if we did this. If nobody knows, then the next thing you need to do is go and ask. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up to fail, actually. Really big leadership stuff, that is.
Sounds like the sort of thing that can apply to small communities and flats and houses, but then also like at a very large societal democratic scale as well.
Yes, yeah. There's a really cool process which comes out of the same stable, actually, called the World Cafe. It's a way of gathering whole communities across difference. So in the UK, I've got a friend who does it in the city of Gloucester. There's a lot of Muslim people from North African countries, and from the Arab world, living side by side with bog standard English people. And so there's racial conflict on the streets. There's issues come up. And they run this thing called the World Cafe, where they just bring them all together. And it literally is. It's set up like a big cafe with round tables and lots of paper and markers, and it's a really kinesthetic way to do things. And you can hear what people are really thinking then, because you cluster them in small groups and they work with some questions. They'll use a circle process to answer some questions. As a group, they then agree on what they want to bring back to the wider group. And you just build a lot of understanding, actually, between groups.
This is really, I think, really interesting, and I'd really like to hear your thoughts before we move on some of that, like, conflict and reconciliation stuff in New Zealand's sort of bicultural context. Do you have any thoughts on how some of those processes can come into play in terms of, like, honouring the treaty and what people can do as individuals, and then also, like, maybe some things the state should do? Feel free to tackle any of that.
Probably the single greatest learning that I had when I was doing this master's studies was John Paul Laidlaw. He's written this little book called The Journey Toward Reconciliation. And in there, he actually has a little play, and I can send it to you because it's a really cool play to do. There's a verse in Psalm 85, verse 10, where it goes something like this: mercy and truth are met together, and righteousness and peace have kissed each other. Now, the word for righteousness there in the Old Testament is synonymous really with justice. So it's mercy and truth are met together, they've embraced. Justice and peace have kissed each other. And John Paul Laidlaw was working in Central America, and he noticed that the religious leaders who were getting together from both sides of the divide of the conflict always read the psalm at the beginning of their time, and he asked them what it was about. And what they said was really interesting. They said, when we're in a situation of conflict and we're trying to come to reconciliation together, we listen for the voices of mercy, of truth, of justice, and of peace. And what they said was that in any conflict there will be a merciful response, and then there will be the truth of what's actually really happened, right? Your village killed people in my village. There will also be those voices that are saying we need justice. You can't just go from one village to the other and kill a whole lot of people. Those people need justice to be done. And then there'll be others who will be looking for, how can we let's just all get along together. Why don't we just get together and get along? And the interesting thing is that in the middle of a conflict, those four voices are almost always there, represented in the people in the room, right? There's people, depending on your personality often, you'll be hardwired for the truth. This is the truth of what's happened. Don't try and soften it. And then there'll be other people who say, yeah, but you know that they've had a really rough time, and if you'd been brought up like that, you might be behaving like that, and we need to be kind, and we need to show Jesus would have shown mercy. And then there'll be the people off the back of their experience who'll say, we have to make things right. It's the making amends and reparations. We've got to fix it somehow. But what most often happens is the voices are there, right? You're talking about this conflict, and the voices are there, but they experience each other as conflicting opinions, right? So the people saying, no, we need to go gently, we need to support them. They end up in conflict with the people saying, no, but here's the truth of what happened. And then the others are saying, no, we need justice. You know, how dare you say we need to just come together and have a nice dinner party as if nothing happened? Justice has not been served. How can we do that? And what these guys in Central America realised and were really committed to was that reconciliation is what happens when all four voices are called forth, they're heard and they're listened to, and they do like almost a dance together to come up with a way forward that attends to the concerns of mercy, justice, truth, and peace. That's what reconciliation means. So you can see where this is going if we bring that into our context here in Aotearoa. You know, there's voices that are saying, you know, we're going to be debating the treaty until the cows come home. You know, we've done this. Can't we just draw a line and say, you know, okay, the treaty settlements have happened. Come on, guys, let's just move on and look forward, right? And then there's other voices that say, but actually, look at the impacts of what's happened. Look at the outcomes of ignoring this covenant relationship for so long and the intergenerational impacts of that. And so in that space you can hear the voice of justice saying, no, we can't just draw a line and say, well, let's all get on and move forward now. And then there are those who insist we have to tell the other side of the story. You know, that our books, many of our history books have been written by Pākehā male educated university people. There's nothing wrong with that, but there's stories that have been passed down through the generations of the other side of the Pākehā story. So I think we've got to have more spaces that are safe spaces where we've got safe processes for speaking and listening, for dialogue, and not for debate, but for dialogue across that bicultural divide. And I think it is happening. I think one of the things that brings me a lot of hope in that space is seeing the number of Pākehā signing up for te reo classes in the wānanga. The wānanga o Aotearoa, you can't get in virtually because it's swamped with people learning te reo. Now, we could say, well, they're just learning a language, but actually language is culture, and it's a sign of deep respect and valuing of another culture that we take the time to actually go into their space and sit in their space with their tikanga, their way of seeing the world, and learn from them in that space. And that brings me huge hope, because I think as we do that, we'll begin to hear our stories. You know, as human beings, that's what we do. When we get together, we tell the stories of where we grew up and the stories our grandmothers told us. We talk about the things that we hope for our kids. We talk about the stuff that's been hard for family members. And all of that is building a picture of who we are as a nation. So I think there's hope, but they're not comfortable conversations. They're hard conversations to have. And they begin by just hanging out together, actually making time for each other. On the making time for each other, Dallas Willard. Have you read Dallas Willard? One of my favourite quotes of his is, it's a story actually of a Christian leader who phoned Dallas Willard across the States one day and said, look, I'm really, really, really struggling. I really want to know, how do I deepen my spiritual life and learn to lead better, learn to lead my people better? And Dallas Willard just said, ruthlessly eliminate hurry. And the guy said, yeah, but, what should I do? And Dallas said, ruthlessly eliminate hurry. And the guy got really shirty with him on the phone and said, yeah, but I want to do something. Ruthlessly eliminate hurry. And, Dallas Willard was talking about that in the context of deepening our spiritual life. But actually, do you want to be a better leader? Ruthlessly eliminate hurry. Do you want to understand people better? Ruthlessly eliminate hurry. Do you want to build relationships across cultures and particularly attend to the bicultural relationship? Ruthlessly eliminate hurry. Make time. And it's the one thing that none of us are good at, because we're hardwired to be busy and to have diaries full of appointments. But if you step back and think for a moment of the times when you've had misunderstandings, disagreements, when you've unknowingly offended someone, when a decision has not gone well, when you've offended somebody cross-culturally, I dare you to tell me that hurry wasn't a part of that dynamic. A lack of time, or feeling pressured, or on our way to somewhere in a hurry, somebody asked something and we flick them off and barge on. We could spend years talking about ruthlessly eliminating hurry and what that looks like. And the second part of your question around, what should our government be doing around the bicultural, I think there are things to be done, and I think they're happening slowly. One of the things I love about the treaty is that it commits us to staying at the table, right? It's like a marriage covenant, it's exactly the same as when the chips are down, if you're married to someone and you've stood in front of each other and said, I will love you in this way, this way, this way, and this way until death us do part, we've made a promise to each other, and the bottom line is that promise means that when the going gets rough, we're still sitting across the table from each other, and we've committed that we're not going to walk away, because that covenant keeps us at the table. And I think the treaty is the same. The treaty for me is like a marriage covenant. We're committed here. We don't get to walk away and say, well, we don't want to be Pākehā anymore. It was a treaty that was signed, a commitment was made, and like any relationship, there'll be ups and downs. There'll be times when the conversation is not a happy one. But if we can stay at the table, that's the gift of the treaty. It keeps us at the table. And whenever we're at the table, we're together, even if we are uncomfortably together. One of the principles that comes out in Matthew 18 is the go-to principle. So when there's a conflict, and I know there's a conflict, Christ calls me to go to the person. Emmanuel Katangele and Chris Weiss wrote a book, and they talk about needing to overcome distance if we're going to deal with conflict. So it's that if I want to deal with a conflict between Rayne and me, we're not going to do that by going off into our separate corners and never coming together. So we have to find practical ways to overcome distance in our bicultural relationships as well. Which is why the wānanga, learning te reo, is such a wonderful thing to do, because it puts us in the room together with people that we can easily live in a bubble from, on both sides of that, actually. Another cool story. When I was at Harrisonburg in Virginia, one of our speakers was a diplomat, an American diplomat who'd worked with the American government during the years of shuttle diplomacy. Have you heard of that term, shuttle diplomacy? It was back in it must have been the late 70s, early 80s, when the whole, under President Carter, actually Jimmy Carter, when they were trying to broker peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And it was called shuttle diplomacy literally because Jimmy Carter and his diplomats would get on a plane. Usually Egypt was the one that was trying to support the peace process. So they'd get on a plane in Cairo and they would fly down to Tel Aviv, have a meeting, negotiate, get to the point of, oh, you're willing to put that on? Great, okay, get on the plane, go back to Cairo. They're willing to put this on the table. Right? So they literally flew backwards and forwards between places. Well, this guy gave a presentation and told some really cool stories about some of the stuff that happened in that time. But one of my classmates said to him, so how is that conflict ever going to be resolved? Exactly what you've just said. What's the government going to do? And this diplomat had 40 years of being a diplomat and trying to broker peace in the Middle East. He said, after all the years I've been working in this field and shuttling backwards and forwards and having endless meetings and negotiations, I've come to the conclusion that lasting peace will not come in those places. Lasting peace is going to be built when neighbours look over the fence at the neighbour who's Arab or Israeli and actually have a cup of tea together. The actually real lasting peace begins with neighbours being willing to meet neighbours. But I found that really moving because often we look at the government and we say, surely it's their job. The Waitangi tribunal, it's their job to do this stuff. But this guy was saying, actually, if we want the kind of peace that we're all wanting to see, it's going to take every single one of us, actually, to reach out and just make the human connection. with a person across the divide.
I know you've already touched on this, but I wonder if you could just expand a little bit more about how we can practice conflict transformation in our own lives.
Yeah.
There's a woman called Christine Pohl who's written a great book called Living in Community, Cultivating the Communities That Flourish. And she has 4 practices. So she looked at communities, all different types of communities that seemed to be doing, that were really healthy communities, and asked herself, so what do they all have in common in terms of what they do? And so she came up with these 4 practices. The first one was, and these are communities that flourish, not just people who hang together, but communities where people can really grow into the fullness of who they are in a healthy way. They're communities that practice gratitude as a discipline. So they commit to practicing gratitude. Secondly, they're communities that make promises and keep the promises they make. So, they have covenants, they have agreements, but then they keep to them. They know how to say yes and they know how to say no in order that they can say yes to other things. The third practice was truth-telling. And this one I really love because in Christian circles we often talk about telling the truth in love. And what that normally means, well, it has for me in my context, is that somebody gets to dig the knife in while they smile nicely in a Christian way, but they're actually really doing you some hurtful damage by the way they're telling the so-called truth in love. So when Christine Pohl talks about telling the truth in love, or truth-telling as a discipline, she talks about affirming without flattery, because flattery is not truth-telling. So holding the two in balance, learning as a discipline, as a practice that we commit to with each other, to affirm without flattery and to challenge without shame. And if we can do those 2 things, then we're going to be healthy for each other. And then the 4th one is hospitality. And she argues that we have to have the first 3 functioning well in order to do hospitality well, but for a community to stay healthy in itself and not become inward-looking and unhealthy, you've got to have that outworking of hospitality. So you can see how very tied in the 4 practices are to each other. So, what does it look like to live in a way that makes for peace? I reckon those 4 practices are a really good start, actually.
We are going to pause this conversation here and come back next week for part 2, where we chat with Karen about Christian leadership and where she finds hope.